Grainy CCTV footage flickers onto the screen. In the dim light, a shadowy figure steps forward, a rifle in hand. There's no face to recognise, no words exchanged, only 3 deafening cracks tearing through the quiet of Virginia. By the very next day, the man behind those shots was in police custody, forced to face the consequences of his brutal act. Today, we're diving into the case that shocked South Australia and left an entire community reeling. And if you want to follow more true crime stories just like this one, make sure you hit subscribe and drop your thoughts in the comments below. It helps us keep bringing you the cases that matter. On the outskirts of Adelaide, in the semi-rural community of Virginia, life often unfolds at a slower pace. Wide blocks of land, scattered homes, and the silence of country nights create an atmosphere where neighbours notice one another, yet distance provides a sense of privacy. It was within this setting that 2 men's paths converged, one as a tenant struggling with his circumstances, the other as a landlord growing weary of simmering disputes. Simon Middleton was known among friends and relatives as a man who had endured difficulties but tried to carry himself with decency. At 49, he remained close to his siblings and was described as someone who wanted stability, even if life had not offered him much of it. Those who knew him spoke of his willingness to lend a hand, of a sense of humour that surfaced despite the weight of his troubles. Living in close proximity was Matthew Draganoff. At 48, he was regarded as a man whose temper could flare quickly, one who carried grievances heavily. His views about personal responsibility, particularly when it came to money and property, shaped his dealings with others. For years he had lived in Virginia, forming a reputation as someone who did not let matters rest easily when he felt wronged. By early March 2021, Virginia itself was quiet. The evenings were cool, the streets dimly lit, and neighbours retreated into their homes. Nothing, at first glance, suggested an eruption of violence. Yet beneath the calm exterior, tension between landlord and tenant had grown. In that stillness lay the prelude to events that would shake the community and expose how quickly resentment can spill into tragedy. From this uneasy equilibrium, the story begins to shift. The days and hours leading up to the night of the 8th of March would reveal how ordinary interactions gave way to a sense of unease, marking the descent into conflict that no one could reverse. In the weeks leading up to that night, the undercurrents between Simon Middleton and Matthew Draganoff became steadily more apparent. What had once been a simple arrangement of landlord and tenant had soured into a dispute that seemed to colour every encounter. Middleton continued to occupy the property without paying rent, a fact that weighed heavily on Draganoff, who saw it not merely as a financial slight, but as a challenge to his authority. The tension was compounded by whispers surrounding a caravan that had been taken, with suspicion, rightly or wrongly, falling in Middleton's direction. Yet outwardly, Simon's life carried on in familiar patterns. He was seen by neighbours walking about, speaking in his usual manner, making no visible effort to conceal himself or to give the impression that he feared reprisal. To many, it seemed that whatever quarrel simmered between the 2 men had not yet crossed into something darker. His days retained a semblance of normality, meals taken at ordinary hours, conversations exchanged without any hint of the storm building beneath the surface. The atmosphere in Virginia, however, told a quieter story. Those who lived nearby spoke of an unease that hung about the property, a landlord whose grievances were never easily set aside, a tenant whose presence had begun to wear thin. In such a small community, people could sense the hardening of attitudes, the way greetings became strained, and silence stretched longer than it should. This was not a confrontation played out in public view, but rather a slow erosion of trust that edged closer to rupture with each passing day. And so, behind the closed doors and along the dimly lit street, the stage was set. The calm routine of early March 2021 would soon be broken. and the conflict that had lingered in the background was about to take its most violent turn. The evening had settled into silence when Matthew Draganoff made his move. Hidden by the stillness of Virginia's back streets, he brought with him a weapon chosen not for defence, but for finality. The Marlin .30-30 rifle, taken unlawfully, was in his hands as he stepped towards the property where his tenant remained. There was no warning, no negotiation. The action was deliberate, formed long before that night. Simon Middleton was in the yard, shifting belongings from one vehicle to another. The tasks were ordinary, the sort of movements that carry no sense of danger. He bent to lift, turned to place, unaware that each step was being measured by a figure approaching in the dark. The calm of the night masked the presence of the gunman until the distance had closed to only a few meters. Draganoff raised the rifle and discharged the first shot. It struck with brutal force, leaving Middleton reeling in shock. A second round followed almost instantly, tearing into his chest. A blow that ensured his survival would be measured only in moments. The final shot was fired as he staggered, striking him again and removing all chance of resistance. It was not an altercation, nor a struggle. It was execution carried out at close range, a sequence of movements calculated to leave no possibility of life. The violence of those 3 shots shattered the quiet of the street. Each report echoed against the stillness, reverberating across the properties and into the night air. In the span of seconds, what had been an unremarkable evening turned into an irreversible tragedy. Middleton collapsed where he stood, struck down without the faintest hope of escape. No one intervened, for the act was over almost as soon as it began. The suddenness, the precision, and the absence of hesitation defined the encounter. It was not born of chance or accident, but of intent. In that instant, the dispute between landlord and tenant ended not with words, but with the crack of gunfire. The scene that remained was one of silence disturbed only by the echoes that still lingered in the minds of those within earshot. The deed was complete. The body of Simon Middleton lay motionless, and the man who had fired the shot stood over the result of his own resolve. From this moment, the focus would shift. The killing had been carried out, the life of a man extinguished, but what followed was equally critical. As the echoes faded, the urgent question arose of who would call for help and how the authorities would respond to a crime that had erupted in their quiet community. The gunfire rolled across the quiet suburb like thunder, each blast jolting those who lived nearby from their evening routines. Windows rattled, dogs barked, and a heavy silence followed, broken only by the shouts of confusion. A neighbour stepped outside, heart racing, and caught sight of Simon Middleton lying motionless on the ground. The shock of what had just occurred cut through the night air. A trembling hand reached for the phone, dialing 000, while others shouted for help. Within moments, panic spread along Brady Street, and the call for police and ambulance was already on its way. Blue and red lights cut through the darkness as patrol cars swept into Brady Street. The call to 000 had been logged only minutes earlier, and already the first units from South Australia Police were moving to secure the scene. Behind them came the ambulance crew, their siren fading as they slowed to a halt outside the property. Officers stepped out quickly, the sound of doors slamming echoing across the quiet suburb. Their torches lit the ground in harsh beams, casting long shadows against fences and trees. In the centre of the yard lay Simon Middleton. He was motionless, his body collapsed where he had fallen. Dark patches spread across the ground, marking the places where blood had flowed freely. The stillness of the figure before them was matched by the silence of the neighbourhood. For a moment, the scene held an eerie calm, broken only by the clipped voices of police securing the perimeter and the urgent requests for medical assessment. Paramedics moved forward, equipment in hand, but the officers knew the outcome before confirmation was given. The injuries were catastrophic, the kind that left no hope of recovery. Even so, the procedures were followed, checks made, and silence fell again as the inevitable was accepted. Around them, the yard bore the marks of sudden violence. Items lay scattered from where Middleton had been working, frozen in the positions left at the moment of the attack. Each detail, from the discarded objects to the stark outline of the body, told its own part of the story. The scene was raw, untouched, and it was now the responsibility of investigators to piece together what had taken place. From that point, the task moved beyond first response. The next stage would be the systematic examination of the site, the gathering of evidence that could explain precisely how the killing had unfolded. The forensic team arrived under the cover of night, their vehicles pulling in quietly as uniformed officers kept the area sealed. They moved with practiced precision, laying down markers and setting up portable lights that cast a stark glow across the yard. Every step was measured, every movement designed to preserve the integrity of what lay before them. The body of Simon Middleton remained at the centre, his position undisturbed until the necessary records could be completed. Photographs were taken from multiple angles, capturing the spread of blood across the earth and the pattern of belongings left scattered nearby. Small yellow tags soon dotted the ground, each one identifying fragments of evidence. Among the first items located were 3 spent cartridges, their metallic sheen dull beneath the artificial light. Each casing was carefully bagged and logged, destined to be matched against the weapon suspected to have been used. Attention then turned to the victim. The forensic pathologist examined the body in situ, noting the entry wounds and the trajectory of the rounds. The conclusion was immediate. Death had been caused by multiple gunshot injuries fired from close range. There was no sign of movement after the final shot. Life had ended there in the yard, within seconds of the first impact. Bloodstains were traced beyond the immediate scene, leading investigators to collect samples for analysis. Around the property, cameras fixed to nearby buildings were removed for review, providing potential visual accounts of what had unfolded. Only after every detail was captured did the team prepare the body for transfer. It was carried with care to await a full post-mortem examination. With the site secured and evidence logged, the investigation would now move towards understanding who was responsible and how they could be brought into custody. Detectives from South Australia Police took control of the scene once the forensic team had completed its first sweep. Their task was to piece together what had happened in the moments before and after the shooting, and to identify the person responsible with clarity strong enough to withstand scrutiny in court. From the outset, the investigation was treated with urgency, for the brutality of the attack demanded nothing less. The first breakthrough came from the network of cameras surrounding the neighbourhood. Officers collected CCTV from nearby properties and requested dash cam footage from vehicles known to have travelled through Brady Street that evening. Hours of material were reviewed, frame by frame, until a crucial sequence emerged. In the grainy light, a figure could be seen stepping out of a vehicle with a long object held at his side. The timing of the footage coincided precisely with the period in which Middleton was killed. Though blurred, the build and movements matched Matthew Draganoff, the man who had long been in dispute with the victim. This discovery set the tone for what followed. Detectives expanded their search to Draganoff's residence and possessions. Items of clothing were seized and subjected to testing. On one pair of shoes, the laboratory confirmed the presence of Middleton's blood. The trace was unmistakable, placing Draganoff at the scene at the critical time. The evidence was no longer circumstantial, it carried the weight of physical proof. Further pressure came from within his own circle. A witness later recounted that Draganoff had asked for help in disposing of incriminating material. The request was blunt. He wanted the clothing burned and the firearm hidden. Such words spoke to consciousness of guilt. the instinct to erase links that could tie him to the act. Instead of protecting him, the statement became another thread binding him closer to responsibility for the murder. By this stage, investigators had built a chain of evidence that was both consistent and compelling. CCTV showed the figure with a rifle. Forensic testing placed Middleton's blood on Draganoff's belongings, and witness testimony provided insight into his attempts at concealment. Each element supported the other, forming a picture that grew clearer with every passing day. The case file was presented to senior officers and then to the Office of the Director of Public Prosecutions. The assessment was decisive. There was sufficient cause to identify Draganoff as the prime suspect, and the application for an arrest warrant was promptly approved. Once authorised, tactical officers planned the operation with precision, ensuring that when the moment came, there would be no opportunity for evasion. The decision to execute the arrest was taken swiftly once the warrant had been signed. Detectives were aware of the risks involved. Draganoff was believed to still have access to firearms, and his history of temper made the approach fraught with danger. For that reason, a tactical unit was assigned to carry out the operation, ensuring that officers would have the advantage of surprise. In the early hours, police vehicles moved quietly into position around the property. Lights were cut, radios kept to whispers, every movement calculated to prevent warning. Officers in protective gear advanced across the grounds, weapons drawn, their focus locked on the house where Draganoff was thought to be inside. The tension was heavy, each step carrying the potential of sudden confrontation. A loud command shattered the silence. Police called upon Draganoff to exit with his hands visible. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the door opened and he appeared, blinking against the torches aimed at him. He hesitated, but with officers already surrounding the property, he had little choice. He was restrained without exchange of fire, placed in custody under the glare of headlights now switched on to flood the scene. Inside the house, further searches were conducted. Amanda Jane Draganoff was taken into custody on allegations of assisting after the fact, while Matthew Hamati, a younger associate, was also arrested for his role in concealing evidence. The operation concluded without injury, but the atmosphere of risk had been real. Police knew that any hesitation could have turned the encounter into chaos. With Draganoff secured and the others detained, the focus shifted once more. The next step would be interrogation, where investigators sought not only to hear his account, but also to test it against the mounting weight of evidence. At the station, Draganoff was led into the interview room and seated opposite two detectives. The tape began to roll, yet his expression barely shifted. He leaned back, arms relaxed, his voice steady as he denied every allegation placed before him. When shown still images from the CCTV, he dismissed them with a faint shake of the head, insisting the footage was blurred, the figure too distant to be identified with certainty. His tone never rose, never faltered, spoke as though the accusations were an inconvenience rather than a threat to his future. At times he answered with clipped sentences. At others, he deflected, circling back to the claim that investigators were mistaken. The confidence was striking, a calmness that suggested either conviction in his innocence or a refusal to yield even an inch. Beside him, his solicitor reinforced the point, pressing the argument that the recording lacked clarity and could not withstand proper scrutiny. Together, they projected an image of composure, as if the evidence already laid out in files and reports carried no weight at all. For the detectives, the encounter was revealing. They now had his version on record, and the next step would be to measure those words against the physical proof gathered from the scene. The investigators drew the threads together with methodical care. Each piece of evidence was logged, tested, and then fitted into the larger narrative of what had unfolded on Brady Street. 3 spent cartridges were recovered and matched to the type of rifle believed to have been used. Middleton's blood was identified on a pair of shoes belonging to Draganoff, a discovery that carried decisive weight. CCTV footage, though contested by the defence, provided crucial images of a man carrying a weapon in the moments leading up to the shooting. Added to this were statements from neighbours who described the sounds that tore through the night, and testimony from an associate who revealed attempts to destroy clothing linked to the crime. Together with the conclusions of the forensic pathologist, the Crown's case gained its structure. What had begun as fragments of suspicion was now a coherent account, ready to be placed before the court for judgment. The trial reached its climax inside the Supreme Court of South Australia, where the weight of evidence was finally laid before a jury. For weeks, the courtroom heard testimony, examined exhibits, and watched the crucial footage that had been gathered during the investigation. When deliberations concluded in June 2025, the verdict was delivered with clarity. Matthew Charles Draganoff was found guilty of murder, his actions judged deliberate and merciless. Attention also turned to those accused of aiding him in the aftermath. His wife, Amanda Jane Draganoff, and a younger associate, Matthew Harmati, were both charged with assisting and concealing the crime. Their cases remained pending, but the shadow of conviction hung over them as proceedings continued. For the Middleton family, the moment was piercing. In their victim impact statements, the pain was laid bare, none more striking than the words of Simon's brother, Mark. He described how the images captured on CCTV haunted him every waking hour, replaying in his mind with relentless cruelty. Although guilt had been established, sentencing was reserved. The Crown pressed for life imprisonment, urging the court to impose the harshest measure available. With judgment secured, all eyes now turned to the final hearing that would determine the scale of Draganoff's punishment. The aftermath of the trial rippled far beyond the courtroom. In Virginia, where the shooting had taken place, residents struggled to reconcile the brutality of the act with the quiet character of their community. Streets usually known for calm were suddenly spoken of in the past tense, as if innocence had been lost overnight. Neighbours expressed shock that such a calculated killing could be carried out so close to their homes, many describing it as an execution that shattered their sense of safety. Across the state, media reports captured the mood with stark language. Headlines spoke of a cold and merciless crime, one that exposed the depths of a landlord's rage and the devastating cost paid by his tenant. Commentators reflected on how disputes left unresolved can spiral into extremes, fueling a wider debate on violence in suburban Australia. In the days that followed, small gatherings formed outside Middleton's former address. Flowers, photographs, and handwritten notes were left at the gate, silent gestures of remembrance for a man whose life had ended with shocking suddenness. Public officials, aware of the unease, gave assurances that justice would be pursued to its fullest measure. Their statements reinforced a promise to protect communities, a pledge made necessary by the sense of betrayal residents now carried. The tragedy, raw and undeniable, had become a warning etched into the collective memory of the suburb. The case of Simon Middleton and Matthew Draganoff stands as a grim reminder of how small disputes, left to fester, can grow into something irretrievable. What began as arguments over money and resentment between landlord and tenant did not remain contained within the boundaries of ordinary disagreement. Instead, pride and hostility pushed it towards an act that ended a man's life and destroyed several others in its wake. The lesson drawn from this tragedy is clear. Personal conflicts, however bitter, must be confronted within the framework of law. Resorting to violence not only silences one voice forever, but condemns another to the weight of criminal justice. The law exists to mediate quarrels, to provide resolution without loss of life. When individuals abandon that path, the result is never justice, only grief and ruin. The message that lingers is one of restraint and responsibility. Respect for the rule of law is not an abstract principle, but a safeguard against moments of anger that can never be undone. To seek redress through lawful channels is to protect not just oneself, but the wider community from the devastation seen on Brady Street. From this, society is urged to remember that violence is final, while lawful resolution offers the chance of peace. What do you make of this case, where a dispute over rent spiralled into a brutal execution? Could such a conflict ever justify violence, or should it always be resolved through lawful means? If you had found yourself in that situation, how would you have dealt with it differently? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We would love to hear your perspective on how such disputes should be handled and what lessons society can take from this tragedy. Do not forget to like this video, share it with others who follow true crime stories, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss our coverage of other major cases. Your engagement helps us continue to bring detailed accounts of the crimes that have shaped communities across Australia.